friends are synths.
Hello and welcome to the latest video in my series of tutorials looking at the Dirtywave M8. In the other videos I've done, I've already covered a whole bunch of different topics, including general workflow, using live mode, an introduction to tables, and also most recently scales. So if you're interested in knowing more about the M8 generally and some of the main features and functionality, perhaps because you've not decided yet whether or not you want to order one, or maybe you've pre-ordered one and you're waiting for it to turn up, then obviously I would recommend going back to watch them as well as this. Now, as a bit of an extra plug for myself in a way, the quickest way I think to learn about song structure and actually making music with something like the M8 or any tracker really is to download and look at other people's song files. And because of that, I have started uploading all of the music I make on the Dirtywave M8 onto my Patreon, and that's not just the stems but also the actual bundle exports from the M8. And the bundles include not just the song files but also the instruments that I use and also the samples, and that way you can download those onto either your own M8 or you can download them onto the Teensy version, the headless version of the M8 essentially. You can go in, you can load them up, you can poke about and get some hands-on experience with actually changing parameters on a finished song. And I think that's a really useful way to learn if you're new to the M8. Anyway, this particular video is going to take a look at using the MIDI out functionality of the M8. So basically using it as a MIDI sequencer or controller. Now there are different ways or different things you can do by sending MIDI data into the M8, but I'm not going to look at that in this video because that's a whole other kettle of fish. I'm just going to be sending MIDI data from the M8 to other devices. Now, as you may or may not know, the M8 has got both USB MIDI and also hardware mini jack MIDI connections. And for the purposes of showing you how everything works, I'm going to be using USB MIDI here. I've already got the M8 connected up to my laptop via USB. That's why you can see this wonderful screen over here. It's called Remote Display. It's a really nice feature of the M8 that means you can capture the screen directly on another device. And this is really helpful because then you don't have to, set up a camera and put it on the actual device itself. The synth that I'm going to be using down here is the fantastic Prophet soft synth from Arturia. This is part of their brilliant V-Suite collection. And I have to say that I am not usually a big soft synth fan. I much prefer hardware. However, this collection in particular is brilliant because not only does it sound great, but it's also got a whole pile of different recreations of classic synths. So if you're looking for good quality soft synths, this gets my vote. Now, the first thing you look at when we're talking about MIDI output on the M8 is the MIDI settings page or menu, and that's from within the project screen or project menu, depending on your nomenclature. I can't even say that word. When we go to the project screen and we have MIDI settings and MIDI mapping, for now all we care about is the MIDI settings page or selection. Go into there and you can see in here, this is where the global settings for transport and sync are. Now there's a bunch of stuff down here about MIDI input, but we don't care about that for just now. I'm also not going to worry about any of the transport options because I'm not syncing this up to my DAW or anything. I'm not trying to control a sequencer. All I'm wanting to do really is send out MIDI note data, but I am going to turn on the clock output, and that's because if there is any kind of tempo synced elements of this synthesizer, I don't actually know if there is in the current preset I've got, but if there is, then I want it to be synced up nicely, so I'll turn that on. You can obviously save these as defaults so you don't have to set them up every single time, which is useful. Now, in order to use the M8 as a MIDI sequencer, we have to create specific instruments that are set up to send MIDI data on a particular channel. So to do that, I will create a chain and then a phrase, and then I'll put a note in. And at the moment, we've got a default instrument here of 0, 0. It is empty and blank. If you're familiar with the instrument screen, you'll know there are a whole different bunch of type of instruments in here you can select, from a wave synth, which is based on the Game Boy, a macro synth, which is from Mutable Instruments. We've got sampler, we've got the FM synth, and then right at the end we've got MIDI output. So effectively what we're doing is, rather than sending note and effects data to one of these internal synthesis engines or sampling engines, it is sending that data out over MIDI. And this is really useful because it means that You don't have to do anything special when composing for the MIDI output. All you have to do is, well, you can mix and match the different instrument types. And this is different than MIDI output was on LSDJ. This is way easier to use, more intuitive, and so it's worth highlighting if you're familiar with that. Now you can see down here that you can send out MIDI data either over MIDI and USB together, or you can send it out individually over just the mini jack connection or USB. So obviously I'm only using USB, so I'm going to send the data out over USB alone. And if all we want to do is control to send out note data, this is all we have to do. So if I go back to the phrase screen, in theory, now if I select this note, then we should hear the Prophet come to life, hopefully. Brilliant. So everything's set up. You can hear the Prophet synthesizer in the background. I will do a very quick sequence. Brilliant, very musical indeed. Now with 8 tracks on the Dirtywave M8, you can have 8 different voices essentially playing simultaneously for each step. So even though there are 16 different MIDI channels that you can assign and play with, you can only send out 8 notes simultaneously. However, because this is a tracker, you can obviously play different instruments within a single phrase, so you don't have to think about it in terms of like, okay, well, track 1 has always got to relate to a particular synth. That's kind of the beauty of trackers, is that you can manipulate or modulate things on each step. So the limitation of 8 voices isn't quite as strict as you might think it is. And there's also a whole bunch of other tricks in relation to playing instruments. So for example, you could use a table and an offset to play things really quickly to make it sound like you're actually playing multiple instruments at once, more than the 8, even if technically speaking it's not bang on the millisecond. However, that's an area for your own exploration. It's something that we used to do a lot with LSDJ on the Game Boy, because there was only 3 melodic tracks, and so you had to get creative in order to make it sound like you had more going on than you did. But 8 tracks is still quite a lot, whatever the limitation is. Now, it isn't just notes that you can send out over MIDI with the M8. You can also define and send out program change and also MIDI CC values, both to change parameters and also banks respectively. Now, in order to do that, we have to go back to the MIDI instrument settings page. And down here, you'll see that we've got these other columns. Now, this one is for program change. And this one, or these ones here, I should say, these rows are for MIDI CC. Now, in the first row, this corresponds to the CC number that we want to change. So, for example, on the Prophet synthesizer, I'm looking at the MIDI implementation chart right here, and it says the filter cutoff is on CC number 74. So I'll set that up, CC number 74. And then what's the other one? Let's say envelope VCA decay time 81. So 81, and there we go. Now this second column here is for the default value, and I'm just going to leave that blank at the moment, and I'll explain why in a second. As you can see, there are 10 different slots for CC values, so that means if you've got more than 10 MIDI CCs that you want to control per synthesizer, what you'll probably have to do is something clever, like make multiple instruments that then transmit in the same MIDI channel but have different MIDI CC mappings, if that makes sense. So just be aware of that. Now, in order to transmit either the MIDI CC or the program change, you do so using step effects. Now, in the effects screen here, you can see there are a bunch of different MIDI CC and program change effects commands. So for example, we've got CCA through to CCJ, and these are our 10 MIDI values relative to what we've defined in the instrument screen. So MIDI CCA is our filter cutoff, and if I cycle through this, you'll hear, hopefully, the filter of the Prophet voice changing. So you get that idea, and of course what we can do is do it per step like this, so that it will swell over time. Which is quite nice. Now, obviously, with MIDI CC values, you have values that go from 0 to 255. And so if you wanted more granular control, you can use tables, etc., to get more than, you know, the individual steps in the phrase here. Now, there are a few other interesting effects that work with MIDI. So I'll create a new phrase here to show you that. There's our note, and what we can do is use the CHD command, which will give us a 3-note chord. And you can see on the screen there it explains. Basically, you have your bass note, and then on top of that there are 2 additional notes. The first digit corresponds to the first note, the second digit corresponds to the second additional note. So, if I play it, nice. Which sounds pretty fantastic. The other effect that is quite nice in there is the add command. This is ADD. This means you can play an additional note in addition to the note that you've chosen in your bass note here. So add. And I guess we could combine these, maybe? Sounds pretty good. And so you do have quite a lot of control when you start to look at all of these MIDI CC values, the chord function, etc. The final command actually which is worth showing is the MIDI pitch bend effect, because there is a dedicated MIDI pitch bend effect here. Let's just stick in a few values. Sounds horrible, but you get the idea. Similarly, you can also use the MIDI program change effect in a step effect. Now, the one other thing you can do with MIDI output on the M8, which is extremely cool, is that you can assign MIDI CC values, or really any value, to the touch screen. Now, obviously, this is pretty difficult to show you because I'm in remote display mode, but I will do my best. And it means that you can use the touchscreen as a really nice, intuitive XY controller for specific parameters. So if I go into this phrase again, and I'll delete all of these CC values, then if we go into the MIDI settings page for the instrument, or the instrument settings page, I should say, you can either momentarily control something using the screen, or you can permanently assign it. And in order to hold this up and show you what's going on, I'm going to have to permanently assign the value. But you hold down the option button and then you choose the value on the screen that you want to relate the touch screen to, and you move either the X or Y axis, and that will basically assign it to that particular axis. So if you watch there, you'll see that it says MIDI map is now assigned. And if I go along the X axis now, we can see this. So if I press play on the sequence, and I can also assign the Y-axis to something different. So let's assign that to the next parameter. Which is quite nice indeed. And this is where that MIDI mapping, section of the project menu comes in handy, because in here you can add these in, you can edit them, you can change the range, and all that kind of wonderful stuff. So if you accidentally map something and you don't want it mapped anymore, this is the place to change it. So that's it. That's a very high level overview of the MIDI out functionality of the Dirtywave M8, which hopefully gives you a bit of an idea of what it looks like in practice. Maybe sets the old cogs turning in the mind about things you could do. Hopefully that was useful, and if not, then I'm sorry for wasting your time. Goodbye.